So in this last part of the lecture, we're going to look at something that's perhaps a little bit nerdy. It's important, we need to go through it, but there's actually not much that really has to sit there in your brain to pass the exam, if that's the important part here. So how do we store this data? Because I've already been talking about the fact that it takes up a lot of space and can do so quite unnecessarily just because of the repetitive nature of a lot of the data. Well, there are different ways of doing this. We can compress the files, but there are different ways of compressing the data. Let's just quickly, we can, if we have a homogeneous surface, let's say we have discrete data, we can actually just turn it into essentially a vector-like object. We can do something called chain coding, where we draw in our raster space, we draw a ring around the bit that is homogeneous, or we can just go along and look for sequences of repetitive data and define that repetition, the run length, to say, well, go this far along and it's all this thing, and then carry on and it's this thing, and then we change to another value and it's going to be for so many pixels that long. We can define, so as long as these chains are long enough, it becomes a more efficient way of storing data. If unfortunately our data is continuous and keeps changing all the time, then this becomes quite an inefficient way of storing data, obviously, because we're having to say, oh, now you're going to continue for 1 pixel with this value, rather than just giving the value and assuming that it's making this explicit. You have to, this implicit positioning, you have to become explicit again, and that takes up more room than necessary. So if we have our discrete data with homogeneous surfaces over large areas, this is quite good. If it's not that way, it can actually make things worse. Hopefully the computer is going to analyze the data and say, oh, this is not a good method, I won't do this. We also have several other methods that are blocking the data, so that we have areas where we just look for these square or block areas and define individual blocks. Obviously this is similar to the cells themselves that we're looking at, not exactly the same, but we're sort of making a variable size pixel, as it were. And even more so when we look at the quad tree, which we're not going to go into on this course. It will come up on the next course, what quad trees are. But here we sort of divide the image into smaller and smaller areas and look for changes or differences in them. But the important point here is the definition between, or the difference between lossy and lossless. So lossy means that there are types of compression that sort of look at the general thing that's happening in a particular area, sort of squints and says, that looks like that color, that'll do for that area. And it's a way of saving a bit of space. Squints in another area and says, yeah, it kind of looks like that. And that's fine if all we want to do ourselves is look at the image, sort of, it's just an image, it's just some pictures. But when we start analyzing the colors, when we start doing that analysis of the data that we looked at earlier, very, very briefly, but when we start doing that, we don't want that, it kind of looks like that color. We want the actual color that's there. So we want it to be lossless. So we don't want these lossy. And lossy nowadays, generally speaking, there are several formats that are lossy, but typically we're talking about JPEG, JPG. That said, there are files called JPG and that are lossless. There are a couple of different variants on JPEG, and a new one came out last year that's being implemented, I think being rolled out more this year, that is actually very good for GIS, supposedly. And it's not lossy, it's lossless. More about that at another time, I think. But generally speaking, what we want is a lossless data, so that we've not lost anything. And TIFF, which is a fairly standard format for raster data, you'll find TIFF and GeoTIFF, essentially the same thing, is lossless. So the take-home message here is TIFF, good, JPEG, bad, basically. Another thing that we just going back to what we just looked at in the previous slide, we could see that there was a method there of going from raster to vector. Because when we looked at one of the ways of compressing it, we essentially vectorized we took some an area of pixels and turned them into an homogeneous surface. It becomes a very blocky surface. It doesn't look particularly nice. We get this kind of pixelated, blocky view of it, but we can do it. We can actually say all of these belong together. All of these are one thing. And that is a common operation that can be done when we want to go from raster back to vector or to vector. So it actually this is why this slide comes in here, because it's actually something we just saw in the previous slide about compression. It's something that actually happens just when compressing. But we can also utilize that function for certain of our analyses. We just end up with this this rather artistic view of reality. So this so far in this terms of storage, we've been looking at basically discrete data stored in perhaps one layer of a raster, one band. When we look at remote sensing with our continuous data and continuous data of several bands, several colors, if you remember from the introductory lecture, we spoke about the fact that we have colors stored as grayscale images that we then combine. We combine several grayscale images. These are what we call bands of data to make color. Typically, we're talking about the red, green, and blue, and infrared. And these are stored in various different ways. This is all it's all fun stuff. It's the sort of thing you will encounter as you progress through your education with GIS and remote sensing. Right now, you just need to have seen this. Don't worry too much about it. But we can store data, the different colored information in different ways. So we have this band sequential, whereby we have basically what we were talking about. We have the red image and the green image and the blue image. Well, that's good. But in order to do any analysis, we're reading in 3 whole images. Now, in these small examples, that's not a problem. But when we start talking about very, very large images and lots of data, this has, in the past at least, been an issue. It still is today. We're talking about reading in a lot of data into the computer. So maybe this is, if we're just talking about doing a local analysis, we're doing our kernel analysis, for example, we're only interested in one part of the image at a time. We don't care what's down here. We're not there yet. We just want the top. So maybe this isn't that great, having to read everything in to begin with. All of the entire image, when actually we're still up here somewhere. And what's happening down the bottom, it's not relevant yet. Later on, we can read it in. But right now, let's wait. So how do we get around this? Well, we could try reading it in, say, the interleaving of the different colors by pixel. And that's fine if your analysis is going to be 1 pixel at a time, which is typically what we do with some of the reclassing. Pixel by pixel, we look at the color in each individual pixel. Therefore, we don't need to have all of the pixels read into the memory to begin with. We can just do them one at a time, depending on how we're doing that analysis, which we'll come to in a later lecture. But we can look at it 1 pixel at a time, and we can start at, say, the top left corner, get in all of the band data, all of the colors that exist in that one particular pixel, and analyze those together. Then move on to the next pixel, then move on to the next pixel, and do that analysis there. So that's quite good if our data has been stored like this, in this band interleaved by pixel. But then we miss this. We've got to load in quite a lot of data before we get to a region that we're interested in. And a good compromise then is the band interleaved by line, so that we can start at the top of the image. We read in all the red, all the green, all the blue for the top rows. And then when we have enough rows to start doing our analysis, we can start running across the image to do that. Then wait for the next line to come in, and then start with the next line of analysis, and then move down row by row. So it's kind of a compromise between those 2 extremes that we looked at previously that generally works out quite well. And this is actually quite common. But all of this is baked into what we can call the file type. How the data is stored is something that we don't always have as much control over as you might think. we can control it. There's definitely ways of doing it, but when it comes to the formats, we have to be aware of what these different file types can manage. And as I said, the TIFF and the GeoTIFF, they're very common. They're quite flexible format. Quite often get your raster data, regardless of whether it's continuous or discrete, will come in this GeoTIFF or TIFF format. Sometimes with the discrete data, if it's class data, it might be okay to store it as an ASCII grid, which means it's text, it's plain text. That means that you can read the data by, just open up in a text editor, and it's kind of boring. It's not like reading Shakespeare. It's just a load of numbers. But you could do that and to look for obvious errors or try and understand what the data is if the metadata were not complete, that sort of thing. So text, it works that way. It's larger than it needs to be, which is why you have this binary grid where you don't have to code everything as text. So this occurs. This TIFF is the most common. We have this image format that's also a very common format. And then we need to look at something called JPEG 2000. So this is a JPEG format, the bad one, but a good one. Yeah. So this is the good. This is one of the good bad ones, and this is actually used by the European Space Agency for their data when you download it. So this is lossless. This is a newer variant of JPEG where it's actually lossless. Not many other agencies use it, but the European Space Agency does, for whatever reason. And this new one that I was talking about that's coming out, this JXL, there are hopes that it will become a standard. Who's hoping that is another matter, but there are hopes that it will become standard. Hopefully, we won't end up with too many different file types, but yes, we will, because as you can see up here, we've already got at least 160 types of raster data. The GDAL, which is a standard library used in a lot of GIS software, uses to read and write raster data. 160 different ways of storing the same sort of thing. Now, a good question to ask is why? Because. Now, there are, of course, historically, you've had file types that have been designed to be lossy, to minimize the file size, and others that have been designed to not be lossy. But the cases in between there really aren't that many. So why 160 file types? Everybody's reinventing the wheel for different reasons. I've come up with a brilliant idea, or I want you locked into my software, not using anybody else's software. So I'm only going to allow you to export this file type that nobody else can read. That has happened as well. Lots of these have become open, but still we're left with an enormous number of file types that we need to handle. And the good reasons for all of them are few. But you just have to live with it. And frankly, most of the time the software will take care of this for you. Not always. This is one of the areas where you can fall down, is getting a file type that your particular piece of software can't handle. So that's the end, I think, there, except to summarize with what's good and bad. Just to go over those main points again. What's good with raster? Continuous data is stored efficiently as it can be in many cases. And we have a structure that allows us to do certain types of analysis. For example, our overlay analysis, where we compare pixels against each other to reclassify them, to get out the colors, to look at the qualities existing in a particular place, or kernel analysis, as we looked at where we were creating the means, or a mode, or maybe looking for doing edge detection. And we generally speaking use them for DEMs, elevation data, or remote sensing data, aerial photographs and so on. But they're not very good when we have class data, large areas of homogeneous information, repeating ourselves, as I am now, repeating ourselves in the data quite a lot, which means it's just not terribly efficient. And also, generally speaking, the things that we create, each pixel is by and large ignorant of its neighbors. It's not a thing, it's not a unit, it's just a cell of a particular class. It doesn't know that it belongs to this house or this lake. It just is on its own ignorant. which is good and bad depending on